Hello, everyone. This is Dora Smith, and you're listening to Engineering the Future Workforce by Siemens. On this podcast, we explore emerging and best practices that are empowering the next generation of talent. The series showcases conversations with leading voices from academia and industry who are committed to improving learners' digital skill set and mindset to accelerate innovation. Subscribe wherever you do podcasts. Online learning opportunities are abundant and available to people in formal and informal educational contexts. And in this episode of Engineering the Future Workforce, we'll examine how ready access to those programs fuels lifelong learning and cultivates human curiosity and initiative. Two words I know are very important to our guest today. Barbara, we're honored to have you as a guest on Engineering the Future Workforce. You're not only CEO of Siemens USA, but you are forever the optimist. So tell us a little bit about how your background has impacted your current role and how you view education.
Dora, it's great to be with you today. I am the daughter of two math professors. So education is kind of everything in my world. In my early days, I was told that, hey, if I did well in school, then I could be anything I wanted to be. That's kind of a pretty tall order, right? Anything? I mean, how do you choose when you can be anything? And so I distinctly remember in third grade when one of those class exercises, when they said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, a grandmother, just because how do you pick? And it turns out now I am, in fact, a grandmother of five. And we are thinking about education in a whole new way because what has been so obvious is that the learning never ends. There are just myriad opportunities every year as new things appear on the horizon and as we continue to develop our own businesses, our own careers, our own livelihoods. Education is at the core of it all.
Oh, those are words that I love to hear. So let's talk more about that. You recently delivered commencement address at George Mason University. I got to ask, what was that experience like? That seems like an ultimate in a career.
Oh, it is such a highlight. Well, first of all, getting my grandchildren to call me Dr. Humpton, that's been part of the fun of it all. No, but Dr. Gregory Washington at George Mason University asked me to come and deliver the commencement address. And, I got some very special help. I don't know if you heard the story, Dora, but it turns out someone who helps us here at Siemens USA doing executive communications was herself a candidate for a doctorate from George Mason University. So she helped me craft the message to graduates. And then she herself received a diploma, and I had a chance to hug her on stage. But looking out, George Mason is an incredible institution, and I knew that not everyone who received a degree was present that day. They had filled an arena, and we were speaking to a very broad audience beyond. But the message is very simple. If you can stay curious, if you can take initiative, if you can commit to lifelong learning, the world is your oyster.
I want to play back actually a few other words that you and her must have worked on. I love this. You said, it took me my whole career to realize what you at George Mason already know. The secret to success is to be altogether different, and we're stronger because of it. Love
Yeah.
those words, Barbara.
Yes.
So we live in a time shaped by, even though we're here in the US, by world events, and we see learning really becoming more and more personalized. During your career, you continue to be a model of that curiosity. So let's delve a little bit into that path of curiosity and give our listeners some nuggets of your knowledge. First, want to talk about technology coming from the software arm of Siemens. I want to hear from spanning your career and just kind of the ongoing, learning experiences you've had. What have been some of the most important factors that really contributed to your personal upskilling journey, if you will?
Yeah. Well, I had gone to Wake Forest thinking I would become a math professor like both my parents. And so I was loading up on math classes, but it was also a liberal arts education. What I didn't realize is that there was a new field being developed at the time, computer programming. And IBM back in those days actually came to Wake Forest University and hired as many math majors as they could find. And you kind of go, why math majors? Well, if you've learned logic and if you learn the discipline of solving mathematical equations, it translates really well into computer programming. And sure enough, I was offered a job. And I thought to myself, well, why don't I go ahead and take this experience? And maybe someday this will make me a better math professor. So I took the next step, had on site interviews, met some fascinating people, and and ultimately accepted a job at IBM. That was great. They were gonna, I came to the Washington area. They were gonna assign me to a project, but first they wanted to put me through some how to be a programmer training programs. And that it was the most delightful experience in my education. I had been raised in the traditional K through 12 and then off to a 4-year degree. And I was always in competition, maybe in competition with fellow students if we were being graded on a curve, maybe in competition against some ideal, earning points and, being the best, all of that. It was something almost competitive. And in that early experience at IBM, they put us in a class and say in a 40-hour program, the goal was not to find out who could get the best grade in the class. The goal was for every single person to be capable of programming when we were done. Oh, even more than that was it was perfectly acceptable to help your neighbor. you know, let's
Love
sit
it.
down and do group exercises. Let's figure out if somebody's struggling with something. We're all going to learn this. And the only grade, if you will, was completion. And and it turns out then we got into programming and found that esprit de corps that's required. And back in those days, there weren't AI tools, et cetera, to help write code for you. We were literally sitting down, reading the requirements from an engineer who had specified something that they wanted our computers to do. And then it was our job to translate that into computer software. And one of the really key elements of that was a peer review. So
Mhm.
you'd finish a piece of code, you'd call a meeting, other people would review your code. And the mystery to me was why is it that I could look at my code over and over again and not see that glaring error that was smack dab in front of my eyes? And it's also possible that somebody else could pick it up and miss that same error. But somehow, when there were five of us, and it generally took at least five, when there were five of us sitting around a table and looking at the same software, the error would suddenly make itself visible and we could correct it. So we were inspecting every piece of software that went in. And that's one of the best ways to learn is by hearing how your colleagues would have, oh, I would have written it this way. Oh, why don't we change it to this? You learned through the practice. So my early career was really driven by an environment where we wanted everyone to succeed. And it was obvious that no one could do the job alone. And it turns out those are great lessons to take into just about any other walk of life. So since then,
So
people have asked me all the time, hey, did you ever consider going back to graduate school or getting an MBA? And I could have, I guess, but in my the choices that I made in my career were to use my work environment as my learning environment. Constantly raise my hand for unusual assignments, ask to be put onto something that would stretch a different skill set. And lo and behold, I like to say I got an MBA from the School of Hard Knocks.
I love that. And I think that cohort type of approach to education is so key when you can have people that are even from different backgrounds and disciplines coming together and doing that teamwork and that kind of peer review. There's so much value from it. I think I heard something recently where you said, learn it, teach it, be it. And that's how we really can capture these new disciplines. Since you talked about coding, and I know you've had a passion and have talked about low and no code and Mendix in the past as well, I guess I'd like to hear your perspective, Barbara, on do tools like Mendix and this maybe tech access, do they allow us to get so many more people into STEM? I often say that there's STEM degrees, but there's also so much STEM adjacent where you can have all kinds of different educational backgrounds. I guess I just want to hear your perspective on that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I like to think of this as who is the tool maker and who is the tool user? I think about the software that Siemens makes, that, the most comprehensive digital twin in the world is a really powerful tool. And if you want to be one of the people who helps advance the underlying software that creates the digital twin, it's important to have that background in physics, maybe a degree in electrical engineering or mechanical engineering, or, whatever those new capabilities are that are being added to the tool. But if you're going to be the person who gets to use the tool, do you need to actually have that degree yourself? Oh, maybe in some fields, right? I know that there are people who are launching space programs, and it's important that they understand and can independently evaluate whether the tool is delivering exactly the result that they would expect. Yeah, okay. But think about all the things that we get to interact with today where, gosh, I don't need to know how my phone works in order to use it effectively. And it's been transformative for my personal life, for my business life. The same thing is happening now when it comes to the fields of programming and overall, sort of the integration of technology into the real world. So, think about low code for a minute. What's powerful about that is when I started my career, there was no such thing as Microsoft Word. If you wanted to have something printed, you typed it up and you took it to a print shop where someone actually typeset the created a machine that would, the printing press would actually print out whatever it is you had designed. And then Word gave us the ability to do that for ourselves. I think the same thing is happening now with coding, where, gosh, I've got access to all kinds of data in my day to day work, and I have access to all kinds of already built systems. But you know what? I need this data to answer a few more questions for me. With low code now, just as a user, I'm able to assemble code just the way I assemble a Word document. And lo and behold, it works. I mean, maybe Dora will talk in a minute about how AI takes that to a whole new level. But the powerful thing is free technology to people. In the past, if you wanted to learn to be a programmer, you'd go to school, somebody would have to teach you. You'd have to come to the technology and learn how to use it. Well, gosh, isn't this a great example of technology coming to us and saying, I'm not as hard to use as you think.
I love that analogy because I think the only coding I did in high school was we had to write code to format it to look like a word, what would be a letter, right? And so you were coding the computer to even just format spaces between addresses and
Think about that.
salutations.
Think about
Um,
that. And then Microsoft had the brilliant idea that, and several others did at the same time. Microsoft with Word ended up kind of being the industry standard. But that whole idea of, let's find a problem that everybody has. Let's solve that problem and change the way business gets done. Well, again,
yeah.
it's transformative.
So let's expand a little bit more on digital twin and just curious as you look at, running Siemens USA, the impact of digital twin um, on employees. And I don't know if you see any difference, Barbara. Does it impact more an early career or a senior employee or across the board? I think recently you talked on a different podcast, the Tech Ed podcast, about the infinity industrial revolution. It's going to keep continuing on. And so with that, just kind of wanted to see your perspective on that digital twin impact on employees.
Yeah. Well, there's first of all, there's this whole field of industrial tech that is now emerging. And what do I mean by industrial tech? Well, we know the digital tools that have transformed the way we shop, entertain ourselves, communicate with each other, frankly, conduct any kind of business on the internet. All of that digital transformation, the the thinking is now coming into the physical world. How we actually use buildings, how we move in transportation systems, how we generate energy, et cetera, et cetera. And key to all this is then how we make things. Well, in order to really transform manufacturing, Siemens has brought the digital twin into the marketplace. the digital twin, the ability to simulate and create a digital rendition of just about anything that you could imagine building. And maybe even going far enough to say the digital environment in which you'll produce it, and maybe the digital environment in which it will operate, right? We can simulate nearly anything now. And when we do that, it actually changes the way we approach our own goals. I've had the privilege of the last several years of going to the Consumer Electronics Show. And every year, Siemens booth features partners. Who are the small businesses who are changing the world? How are they using Siemens technology? And everything from people who want to take tourists to space in a hot air balloon that's as big as a football field, to people who want to do underwater gardening, to people who are building prosthetic limbs for children who've lost their limbs in conflict zones. All of these people are using digital twins first to design the products they intend to bring to market. And then they use it to perfect those products. And frankly, you can do a heck of a lot of work before ever using any physical components. And we think about that from a sustainability perspective, that's huge. But even more than that, from a schedule perspective, because how long does it take to actually build something and put it through trials, only to find that, oh, this isn't exactly what I wanted. Let me start again. Instead, in the digital world, we can try again. We can use multiple permutations. A digital twin that actually uses elements of generative design, so that you say, you know what, I need to design a component that will be less than this weight and will fit in these dimensions and is capable of. And because we have tools now that will go through computations and bring back the optimal design for that object, we're doing things that would have taken us, well, maybe forever to invent, maybe never to invent. So I'm excited about the power of what digital tools can do for us. Now, what does it do for people? What I keep finding is that this appeals to people at every stage of their career. Of course, you think, oh, a digital native is going to love this. Jump right in. I'm going to show you how to use digital twins in order to, design things for this manufacturing environment. But it turns out the people who've been living in that manufacturing environment maybe for 4 decades know the limitations, and they're thrilled when they get access to a new tool. And a great example of a customer Siemens is working with right now, and I think it's pretty well known publicly, is the Navy's shipyards. Now think about this. The Navy has been building ships for centuries, and yet, they've been maintaining ships, and ships have to live for decades in their service. And they come in, they hit something, something goes wrong aboard the ship while they're at sea. They come in for repair, maintenance, maybe overhaul. And what does it take for that operation at the shipyard to actually get the job done? Well, it turns out it's really complex, maybe one of the most complex manufacturing environments we'll ever encounter. And Siemens has been working with the Navy to create digital twins so the Navy can understand, how does product flow? How do people flow through the shipyard? How could we optimize our performance? And we're already just in the first few experiments with this. We're not only finding ways to save time, but we're finding ways to save billions of dollars. So it's an exciting time to be working with a digital twin.
Yeah, it's really been interesting for me, and I feel like I'm dating myself with the coding example I gave. But when I started in this industry, we talked about virtual product development, but we didn't have the technology to truly deliver on that. And so to see where we're at today with the digital twin, with those kind of real world examples, is just fascinating to me that we now are able to make that a possibility and move it to really this kind of software defined product in the future, right? It's no longer about you design the box and the thing and then the software goes inside. You're starting with the software first, and it opens up so many possibilities. And that's why I think it's great at Siemens, right? We've got, 4 or 5 generations of people working together, and it's great to have young, innovative minds, and yet those that have seen so much, come together and really collaborate. So I think it's a great time.
I think it is too. And I probably have seen the greatest transformation in our own Siemens organization where people have taken advantage of this idea of the multi-generation workforce. So take our operations down in Grand Prairie, Texas, where we're building the electric switchgear that goes into data centers. You can't have AI without data centers. You can't build data centers without switchgear because these machines they consume a lot of electricity. So we've got operations down there, and the question is, how could software help us? And what that team did was simply identify some digital natives and hand them iPads and a few basic tools, and said, "Get out on the floor, find out what the pain points are. Let's see how we can transform our operations." It became an exercise in just sheer creativity because the digital native doesn't fully appreciate the real craft of manufacturing. The lifelong manufacturer has no idea about what would be the art of the possible with these new digital tools. Put them together though, and chocolate, peanut butter, you get your treat.
Well, let's move on to talk a little bit about the role of universities to really meet industry needs. And I think the last time you and I were physically together was at an ASCE Industry 4.0 summit. And you talked there about this concept of lifelong learning, and I think even university as a service. I think some of the results from that summit just came out or were published by the NSF, and it quoted you as saying that you envisioned universities of the future serving lifelong learning needs through a membership model. And I guess I want to see, do you feel the same? Do you think that's possible? And what maybe needs to change in industry and in academia to make that possible?
Wow, Dora, it's interesting because you get to live and work and shape this sector. I mean, I'm thrilled that we have someone like you with your deep insights working with universities on these topics, and I get to drop in from time to time. I am absolutely still committed to this idea that universities are places of learning, that professors have a gift and a skill for delivering content, engaging learners. And in those times since that session that we had, we've seen some online learning begin to get some uptake, but we're also seeing its limitations. So I'm more committed than ever to the idea that a university is a critical building block to the ecosystem that we want for our future. And then you start to ask, well, what does that look like? I was talking just last week to someone who has put together a different kind of offering online. What it has as an element of it is a personal contact, coaches who are engaged with the learners in order to, first of all, make sure they stay engaged, so that we don't drop out as many people, so that people are motivated to stick with it. In essence, there's someone who cares, who's bringing a student along. I think that's a valuable part of this. What he's found in his offering is an incredible success rate. So, if you and I were to look at typical online MOOCs that are just available for anyone to take, it really depends on the motivation of the individual. Great for highly motivated learners. But what about for people who just need that experience, that learning? What can we do to give them a different experience? I'm a firm believer that universities can continue to build out the flexibility of their offerings while maintaining the human touch. Now, I want to tell you a funny story from George Mason University. You asked about graduation. When I was learning a little bit more, getting some more insight from President Washington about his students, his faculty, and the way the university is running, he said that during COVID, they had sent everybody home and everybody had gotten used to working online. So we know that's a form that can work with us. And he said, then, the world opened up again and students came back to campus. But what they said is, we want to come back to campus, but we still want to do virtual learning. He was a little baffled about, wait, what's going on here? the fact is that we all have different learning styles. And so, yeah, some classroom learning is good for a lot of people, but that online learning is fantastic, especially with a learning cohort that are perhaps employed already, or perhaps our parents and need a lot more flexibility in their lives. And I don't mean to go on about this for too long, but what I want to do is bring us back to that topic then of, can a university actually become a lifelong partner to its students? I believe so. And I don't know what it's going to take for us to really get the ball rolling. Right now, you see universities reaching out through sports. How do we keep our alumni engaged? It's through winning sports teams. Well, I am thinking that in the future, what we're going to see are some universities who sort of rally around the idea of winning people. The idea that they've got a bunch of graduates who are winning at the game of life, engaged in lifelong learning, coming back to hone their skills in a variety of things and to make them more effective in what they're doing day to day. And I think that's going to be exciting.
You got me thinking, Barbara, that I think there's probably an area of collaboration for, what we as a company are learning around the future of work and all of what we learned coming out of COVID to get people back in the office, engaging and collaborating that way, and what the schools learned as well, and where we might come together. You also reminded me of, because you talked at the beginning about peer review. It was one of the interesting things we're learning with some of our academic partners. So you may have seen earlier this year, we announced this credential program and University of Colorado Boulder. We stood up a sustainability credential with them. And it's been interesting because they have all that kind of data and expertise in the classroom. They've had a little bit online, and now with this whole new credential space, the peer review was the big tool that got students to stay engaged with the online content. And so this kind of blended learning approach to give you still that same feeling of a cohort and a team while you're still kind of independently studying, and those check-ins along the way. And so I think what we're going to learn about learning, right, as more of this stays online, I think is going to be fascinating and guide us forward.
I think so too. First of all, I'm so proud of what you all did in reaching out both to Penn State and to Colorado. I've been really, really proud of what you all have done with the University of Colorado and at Boulder and also Penn State University. Because I really think we have almost a responsibility. There aren't many companies who know what Siemens knows. And so you sort of ask the question, if not for us, what would happen if? And what are some of the topics we need to be involved in? What are the places we need to be engaged in helping to educate? And if we can do our part, then we know we can help develop the workforce of the future. So so you're having that fabulous experience. So one of the things we discovered in mentoring kind of parallels this whole thought of cohorts. Right. This also was during COVID, and I don't think this was because COVID. It just happened to be at the same time. Someone in our people and organization group had the idea that we could create mentoring pods. And I love the word pod. We're all swimming together, if you will. And the idea was with a mentor and then call it 6 members of a pod interested in exploring a topic. Then the mentor could be available to sort of guide the learning. But much of what goes on happens just amongst the members of the pod. First of all, getting together, hey, what have you read? What do we know? What kind of questions do we have? Then maybe working with the mentor on areas of curiosity, where do we want to take things? And following up on that and meeting again, say, instead of, say, a monthly meeting, maybe meeting once a quarter. What you find out is the pod is meeting continuously. They're learning from each other and then checking in periodically with the mentor. Well, I mean, I'd never had that experience before of feeling like there was this multiplying impact. So
Yeah.
this human touch, this idea of checking in, the idea of working with one another I think this is going to be one of the secrets that unlocks the power of the potential.
Power of the potential, the power of the peer. Yeah. I know
Mhm.
some of my team has participated in those mentoring pods and found them quite
Mhm.
valuable.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, you meet with a lot of customers, you deal with a lot of interactions, um, to use your word, kind of ecosystem to get feedback. What are you hearing from customers that you think impacts, that we need to have front and center, that impacts their learning needs and efforts?
I think what I'm hearing the most is people feel overwhelmed, that things are changing so fast. There's another thing, Dora, that I think people are really grappling with, and that is we just don't have all the people that we need to do all the jobs that need to be done. So, I hear all the time from customers who say, gosh, I don't have the people who are trained in the tools that you're proposing that we use. And so we're thinking through what are some of the creative things that we could be doing even at the national level to help solve these problems. So first of all, this message about both AI and other like low code, making it easier for people to engage with technology. That's key. I would tell you, as a technology provider, 90% of this is on us, right? Should people walk up to a piece of technology these days and be presented with, the equivalent of a slide rule from ancient days? This is what computer interfaces used to look like. Or should they be presented with something that has the look and feel of what they've become used to in this new digital world we've been living in? So let's get our user interfaces right. The things are going to be much more intuitive to use in the future. That's going to open doors for people to be able to enter the world of work that we're trying to build. But then the second part of it is giving people access to the tools in settings where they can learn. I think one of the most powerful things is, and you've been smack dab in the middle of this network, is the network of community colleges. I think that in the US is the equivalent power of the apprenticeship program in Europe. And we know how effective apprenticeships are in the European setting. People learn at a very early age, they're interacting hands-on, they're being exposed to, multi-decade veterans in a certain craft or discipline, and they begin to learn as they work. I truly believe, and we've seen this as Siemens quite a bit, that the community college network is going to be an essential player in helping to activate people as they go through massive career transformations. Now, we've put this to work in our own way. That is back down to Texas, where we're building that switchgear and we can't build it fast enough. We actually built a new factory. The factory ultimately is going to employ 700 employees. We can't find that many experienced electrical equipment manufacturers in the Fort Worth area. What are we going to do? The team actually hired retired high school principals and high school teachers and put
Mm.
together a faculty so that we can hire people from all walks of life. We could bring them into a program where they get first some classroom based education, how to use this equipment. They get exposed to the digital twin basically on day one. Then we put them into a mock up manufacturing line where they get a chance to get hands on experience in the actual craft. And then they enter the workforce. Well, I mean, this is powerful.
Right.
And I'm what I'm envisioning, we're doing this for us, but what I'm hoping to do over the next few years is ensure that Siemens technologies, such as software for the digital twin, are made available to partners who see the promise of educating large groups of people. I have in mind labor unions, for instance, who have the ability to reach a workforce that will just thrive with these new tools. So, these are some of the things that are underway now. So, from the work that's being done at the elementary school level through many of our colleagues, through community college, into the university level work that you've been such a trailblazer in, all the way out to those lifelong learning organizations like labor unions, we have the potential to actually, bring this full cycle and have this be a flywheel that continues to educate people as they go. And I think really remove the fear factor in the process.
Yeah, accessibility and usability. I think if we can address both those, that will be key.
Mhm.
Uh, let's come back to, I guess, the skills that you really see as being most critical. And I think I heard just was it maybe the week before last, you were speaking with Daniela Proust, who's head of P&O or HR for Siemens USA, and you guys were talking about what skills are critical for life. There's this whole Skills for Life initiative at Siemens. Can you share a little bit that are top of mind for you?
Yeah. This is the first year that Siemens has had a people strategy, a very overt people strategy that sits side by side with the business strategy. It actually has three parts, and they're all worth considering for just a moment. One is organize for impact. And, everybody's wrestling with things like, how should an org chart structure be drawn? And I think we've come to learn org charts are drawn in 2 dimensions and real life is 3 dimensions or more. So we know that we can't solve everything with an organization. So, okay, well then what do we need? We need leaders who transform. We need leaders who really demonstrate skills that are going to make it effective for the organization to work across boundaries, not in 2 dimensionals up and down a chain way, but actually in 3 dimensions, working across to find the experts to solve a customer's problem. So when you hear Daniela talk about this, you'll often hear her talk about, looking for the skills for life in areas that in the past you would have said, wait a minute, that's it's a career skill. But in fact it is. The ability to collaborate is right now one of those things that sets strong performers apart from the rest. The ability to manage your own lifelong learning, to recognize you don't know it all and to be curious enough to go out and figure out what you need to learn next and then find a way to get it. Uh, if we can manage to select people who have demonstrated really strong outcomes, no matter what their degrees are, no matter what their qualifications on paper are, we're going to be more effective as a company. So, so here we are, focused on things that you might have thought of previously as soft skills, but they're not. They're the rock solid foundational skills everybody needs.
We like to call them durable skills,
That's right.
professional skills.
Yes.
Um, so let's talk about because at Siemens we leverage now this growth mindset and how we speak to our peers and to employees, even in those probably mentoring situations. How do you think we can cultivate that with the help of online learning opportunities? And I'll just share one that I'm grateful for. There within Siemens, we have this amazing tool called My Learning World, and it has Siemens content. It has all kinds of content piped in. And through one, I believe was through Coursera, there was this well done course on learning how to learn, both
Ah,
for us as adults, but also how teens learn. And it's something that helped me as I'm trying to help my kids as they move on into college. So I guess I wanted to hear a little bit from you, either how you think we can help our own employees and cultivate that, and maybe anything interesting you've learned recently.
well, yeah. And I think about for our listeners, if they don't know about My Learning World, then it's actually a really interesting story to tell. Once upon a time, people developed course catalogs and they offered courses, and you'd sign up for, in person or online, and, you take your course, et cetera, et cetera. And this is one reason Daniela Proust is the head of people and organization in the US, because she was responsible globally for this, really rethinking how do we put together our learning modules. And she had the brilliant idea to use the tools that are available to us today, including AI. So, having an AI driven platform that allows us as individuals to articulate what it is we're interested in and allowing then My Learning World to queue up for us a series of things that may actually help us. Now, I'm going to tell you, a couple of years ago, I had done back in that day before My Learning World had actually developed into the full sort of rich offering it is, I had taken something that was a diagnostic, a digital literacy diagnostic. And sure enough, found out, hey, there are a couple of areas where I've got gaps. And so I went to my learning world, and by querying, et cetera, I was able to put together a few online classes and got comfortable with those areas that had shown up as weaknesses for me. Within the last year, I joined the board of a blockchain company,
Mm.
and Mara is its call sign and its name and its stock symbol. The so with Mara, as I was going through the interview process, I thought, if I actually were to accept this opportunity, what don't I know? And I decided to use my learning world to guide me through learning. It took me through a ton of stuff, Harvard business kind of articles through to some great podcasts that I listened to and a Coursera course, and as well as a Coursera course on blockchain, which gave me that very rapid fire leg up to be able to understand the dialogue that management's having and really get fully on board. So I guess, I share that just to say I'm a believer with you
Yeah.
that, right, that if we're in a situation and we go, I'd like to learn more, my learning world is the place to go.
And we'll put this in the show notes, but you just reminded me of Barbara. There's a really good, I think it's a World Economic Forum piece that looked at lighthouse companies doing great learning work, and it has a whole thing on My Learning World. I think it's called "Putting Skills First." And back to what we were talking about, that kind of human digital connection. A piece of that being these curators across Siemens. We have like thousands of curators working in My Learning World that are experts in AI or blockchain, right? And they're finding the best of the best content and creating the pathway to make that easier for all of us.
That doesn't happen by itself.
Right. Um, so we talked a little bit about skills and some of the learning we've both had. I guess I'd come back to this credentials piece, Barbara. And if you're interviewing folks now or talking to some of the hiring managers across your company, are there specific credentials that would really speak volumes to you that that's the talent we want to bring inside?
This is a fascinating question. I'll take you back a few years. We truly understood a few years ago that our own hiring process was limiting the talent we had access to. There was a time when common wisdom was, if you don't have an electrical engineering degree, a mechanical engineering degree, then how in the world could you possibly be productive at Siemens? And we were going to schools that, graduated these sorts of people, and we were successful at bringing people into the company. But that question of where are we going to get the people as we continue to grow, where will we find the talent? The schools aren't graduating enough of these folks. Then it occurred to us that we were interviewing and we were too focused on the degree, the certification, the credential. And what we really needed to be focused on was the capability. So we went through a massive process of scrubbing through all of our online postings, our recs, to say, here's really what we're hiring for. We need these capabilities. And if you have these capabilities, you can be considered. Now, if someone has a credential to back that up, that's valuable too. But the most important thing is the capability. And it's really revolutionized the way we've thought about talent. Now, what happens when push comes to shove and you're ready to hire somebody? The real trick is to try to figure out, has this person demonstrated, right? Does their past predict their future? Have they demonstrated the ability to perform successfully if we were to select them for this role? And here's where it gets really fun in the interview process. Because instead of interviewing with hypothetical questions of what would you do if, the real question is, tell me about a time when you've actually, delivered something like this, turned around a situation like that, or dealt with a difficult problem like this. And now tell me the role you play. Tell me the outcome of that. And when you go through that interaction, it turns out that you come to a hiring decision with a higher probability of success in the actual role. And we've gotten some hires who, seem surprising. Oh, you've selected. I have one right now who's taken the role of head of strategy inside Siemens USA. She came to us from the government affairs organization. And it just turns out that in her past, she had demonstrated all of the critical development superpowers that we needed for this role. And Denise Quarles is now in the role. And it turns out she started her career in manufacturing. So in essence, she was a customer of Siemens. She moved into sustainability and would have been somebody who would specify, maybe she would have been a customer of Siemens in that world too. And comes to Siemens now. And even though she spent time in government affairs, and people would say, that typecasts her. Instead, it turns out she has all of the key skills that are needed for the strategy role. And so I'm encouraging people everywhere to do the hard work. The hard work is really thinking through what are the things that the role demands? And then how can we articulate those as capabilities so that people can compare their own backgrounds to what is truly required by the job. And it makes it a little harder because we can no longer use the shorthand of four-year college degree with a degree in science, some science-based thing, standing in for ultimately the job that we want to get done.
Yeah, and that's our hope, I think, with these recognized credentials is that they give that further proof of those capabilities. And then you get into the interview, you use that kind of behavioral interviewing to really find more about that person to see that they're going to be the right fit. So let's move on to advice. And I always like to hear, if people were to write a letter to their younger self, we're now hearing, you've got grandkids, the advice maybe you offer to your kids or your grandkids as you think about them in the future workforce. What would you emphasize to them? Any particular area you tell them to stay focused on and thinking about their own knowledge and skilling?
Oh, well, first of all, my number one message is have fun. There is nothing here that is going to be beyond them in terms of their ability to grasp, to participate, and I think we spend. I'll go back to the conversation about my early education was all about racking and stacking and judging and it was full of pressure. And we thought back in the day, that was the best way to instill learning and ambition, et cetera. I would tell you right now that what I hope is that my grandchildren are going to be enjoying school. They're going to be enjoying learning new things, trying and experimenting, knowing that, hey, if something doesn't work well, that's not failure. That's part of the process. And then being able to pursue lifelong learning in so many different forms. I look back and I think about all the times that I worried, especially early in my career, am I doing it right? Are other people getting ahead faster than I am? All of that just feels so irrelevant now. And I wish that I had just enjoyed myself more in the midst of all of that.
That's sage advice. In fact, I think I heard you once say, don't fret. This is going to be an amazing ride. If we could just give ourselves that advice. All right, great. Well, Barbara, just, thank you so much for your passion and your leadership and your example in learning and beyond. We're so grateful to have you on today's show. And that's all the time we have for today. So you can find Barbara regularly on her own podcast, The Optimistic Outlook. Highly recommend. And me here on Engineering the Future Workforce. We'll put some links to some of the resources mentioned in today's show in the show notes. And thanks again for listening. And keep an eye out for both of our next episodes.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Engineering the Future Workforce. The show notes include links to any resources mentioned in today's show. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe so you never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.